by writing this very interesting memoir of your political exile here in Paris. And I read your book more than twice.
Oh my goodness.
There are passages I just love because the way you write makes everything accessible. So thank you for that. And my curiosity was actually fueled by my own research. And there are parts of your book that answer questions about the African-American slavery history in America, but also the history of African-American expats here in France, beginning with the 2 world wars with the military, but then with the artists. And also, you know, you have a unique style. In fact, your book is a conversation, alternating witty and funny anecdotes with darker and deeper subjects, and that are very instructive and make us reflect upon also the common parts between the African-American history and the European and French colonialist history, and the differences too. I really enjoy your portrayal of some of our American expat members here in Paris. You know, they're really lovely ways of talking about them. And I was very moved by the way you paid tribute to 2 of them who have departed, Tyler Stovall and Patricia LaPlante-Collins. So really thank you for that, for making them, you know, like live a little bit longer through your book.
Well, and Ellen, the entire book is filled with what I call a cast of characters.
Yeah.
Because the book is as much the stories of the expats living in Paris as it is my story. And it's a very rich community. It's a community that I found very empowering, very inspiring, and very comforting while I was looking at America falling apart under Trump. And one of the reasons, I'm very sorry that I'm not there this evening, because I wanted to introduce people in the audience who are in the book. And I just can't believe that I've come to my beloved Paris and in 72 hours got COVID. And I'd been running all over the United States, divided America, blue states, red states, never tested positive. Paris, how can you do me like this? But I'm happy to be here. Happy to be here.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, but still, you're really pretty much there, you know, and your charisma, you know, comes through Zoom. Really, I mean, really. And I really encourage people to read the book because it's like a film. I told Audrey the other day that the whole book could be a film, you know. I mean, it could be a documentary or fiction, you know, because sometimes this, you know, Trump years were like, you know, nightmarish. And
Still are.
Although at first I asked you, you know, but why in fact did you run? You know, those were my first questions, and those are the first questions we ask when we start the book. And that was at the end. I understand that through your history, your own history, and your deep African-American, New Yorker, Brooklyn belongings, explain some of it, but not all of it. So there's a first talking point here. You know, I would like to ask you, Audrey, you describe yourself as having achieved with great satisfaction your life in America, seizing educational and professional opportunities that make you strongly rooted in America. So what weighed the most in the balance of your choice to run?
The simple fact that America at this point in time, or any point in time, elected Donald Trump president. And I had been saying all along when he first announced that he was running, if he wins, and I never thought he would, I would leave America. And I've never made that kind of declaration, but this is a man who had never been elected to anything. As far as I know, he'd never been a hall room monitor. So the first time he runs for office, it's for the presidency of the United States, and he wins. And instinctively, I knew America was in trouble. And I knew at this age and point in my history, I didn't want to be here. Now, I didn't think he was going to last. So when I left, I thought I was only going to be gone a few months because I just knew that the American public would realize it had made a mistake and I would come back. That didn't happen. I didn't leave thinking I would do a book, but once I knew I had to stay or I would be staying longer than 3 months, I did a piece for the Huffington Post, which went viral. And the reaction was so intense, that made me think there might be a book. It might be the subject of a long, excuse me, exploration. So that was the catalyst.
How long, in fact, did you stay? Because there's a mystery here. I've been trying, I know when you arrived in Paris, but when did you in fact return to the States?
I arrived in
2017.
January 18th, 2017, 2 days before Trump was to be inaugurated. And I guess I was here the first phase, 3 months.
Okay.
Two and a half, because in Paris, you can't stay longer than 3 months. If you do, you lose your visa. So I stayed 2.5 months, went back to the States, came back, stayed another 2.5 months, and did that pretty much for 2017.
Okay.
And again, I didn't think it was going to be a permanent situation. But as time went on and things got worse and worse, it was clear he wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
So I had to figure out what I was going to do.
Okay. And okay, so that's clearer for anyway for me. And there's another in one of your chapters, you when you return briefly to New York in your different trips to and fro New York, Paris, you describe a scene showing an abusive communication with a white woman and your group of friends. And this is a starting point of a remembrance of how racist ill treatment of Blacks in the US started growing again following Trump's election. And we understand this is one of the main reasons of your temporary exile, but I seem to understand that although this was a reason of your exile, you had to face some obstacles in this exile, and I seem to understand there was some homesickness at times. And so how did you overcome those obstacles?
The homesickness was for American comforts, not American culture. The winter of 2017 was the worst winter in France in 30 years. I lived in a tiny apartment that had a space heater to heat it. So my very first night in Paris, I'm deep under the duvet, ran out and bought a flannel nightgown because I bought the wrong, pajama wear. And I said, I miss America. What I missed was central heat. That's I missed elevators. I missed American comfort. But it was so, to me, what's the word? Just refreshing to be in a culture where race was not paramount, where there was not a maniac running things, that I got used to the discomfort. I was surprised I could get used to physical discomfort. Spiritual discomfort is another matter. And that's what drove me to leave. So
thank you for that clarification. And the other question I would like to ask you is, considering the racial situation in US and France is different, and you accurately point that American and French racism is perceived according to one's individual and racial history. And that was a very interesting point in your book. Considering that people like my grandfather chose exile, and he wrote in I Chose Exile that, you know, he felt more freedom, you know, in one street of Paris and then in the whole of America. What made you feel freedom in Paris particularly, and what eventually limited that freedom?
You know, what I've always said about the French, what I love about the French most of all, is that they leave me alone. There is a respect for your autonomy. There is a respect for your personal privacy. The example that you mentioned earlier, talking about friends of mine, there's one chapter in the book that is set back in the States, in Brooklyn, in a private club that I joined just before coming to Paris. And it's an former old boys club, you know, one of the clubs where Jews couldn't belong, Blacks couldn't belong, women couldn't belong. But over time, these kind of clubs kind of fell out of favor. And they really had to open it up to a more universal membership. So I was, you know, one of the Black members, one of the few female Black members. And I joined because they had a senior rate, because I was also a senior. And I would go to the club. It was near where I lived. It had a lovely dining room. I would take friends. And I had just come back from Paris. I took a group of friends. We're sitting in the club, talking, minding our own business. The place is kind of filled. We were the only, there were 6 of us. We were the only Black people in the space. I guess 15 minutes into our conversation, a woman approaches from across the room and says, "Hey, which one of you is a new member? I haven't seen you here before. One of you must be a new member." And immediately my hackles went up. I had just come from Paris, where that kind of invasion of space would never, never happen. So the woman was interested in one of the men in the group. She pretty much hit on him. She started rubbing his head. I got up and took her back to her group, which was a couple. They were very embarrassed because they knew she was totally out of line. She broke away from me and went back to the male friend that she was interested in. He finally sent her on her way. We didn't hear her say this to him. She finally said, "I'm gonna make you my man." Then she said, "I'm gonna make you my boo." And then she said, "I'm gonna make you my bitch." To which he said, "You gotta go." And I was just outraged, but I didn't want to make a scene. But this is the kind of affront that is typical in America. We call it exercising white privilege. I don't call it privilege. It's arrogance, it's inconsiderate. It's a lack of respect for the humanity of people you think you can just encroach upon. And that's a recurring, that's a commonplace occurrence in America. And it's so common, we don't even think about it. And my favorite, I love people, you know, white people will say to me all the time, "Where are you from? You're so articulate." It's like, French would never, never, never take that kind of liberty with anybody, because there's a basic, I feel, a basic respect for your humanity, regardless of your color, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender. And when you're outside of that, it's so glaring when you see it. So to be outside of that, for me, was just wonderful, it was liberating.
But were there, because, you know, like things aren't always perfect, like, you know, in Paris, were there limits to that freedom?
I don't know if there were limits so much. I think there could be cultural misunderstandings.
Yeah.
You know, I was guilty. I have a scene where I meet a woman in the laundromat. She comes in with a younger guy that I thought was her boyfriend, and he turned out to be her son. And I made the faux pas of saying, oh, he's your son? I thought he was your boyfriend. She was very offended, very offended. What she was offended by wasn't so much that's what I thought, it's what I told her. I didn't know her, she didn't know me. I really had no business telling her who I thought the young man. But that's an American thing, we do that. We do that. And it's what I call kind of imposing your opinion, putting your mouth on a subject that you don't have any business putting your mouth on. That's, Americans do that. So I was guilty of Americanisms, which also became very clear.
But are there Parisianisms that annoyed you?
Americanisms that annoyed me?
No, Parisianisms.
Yeah, Joe and I were just talking about this. I don't think the French are as efficient as the Americans. I think there's a tendency to like have this blasé. You know, I've asked people, you know, how to get to Montmorency, and they'll say they don't know, and it's the next block. Now maybe they really don't know, but I think a lot of times they just don't want to be bothered. So that's can be annoying. That can be annoying because again, Americans are the opposite. If you ask for help and they can help you, chances are they will. It's kind of, you know, I want to let you know that I have information you need. But to me, those are slight annoyances compared to the bigger ones that are experienced in America.
There's another limit in Paris or in France that you mentioned related to how you get permanent residency here. I mean, there's a whole chapter where you describe the administrative heaviness here.
Yeah, well, first of all, the process here is all in French. And if you don't speak French, I don't speak French. And you go and you try to apply for what we call the green card. And I interviewed Pat White, who I love. She's a woman, Black American woman, retiring in Paris. I love Pat because she did not know a soul in Paris, came, you know, at a retired age and did things like get a green card. But she talked about going to the office to do that. And she took a friend who did speak French and the friend wasn't let in. So here she is not speaking French. She's got to navigate this very complicated process on her own, which she did. I don't think I could have done it. Yeah, so the bureaucracy is kind of Byzantine. The attitude that you have to speak the language if you want to get a green card, when very often people don't speak the language, which is true in many countries of people trying to establish residency. So yeah. One
of the positive points you made about life in Paris, although Paris is the most expensive city in France, you did say that the discrimination in France or in Paris was more about class than color. Is that something that you still, you know, feel?
I do.
Today?
I do. Yeah, because, you know, Europe, the whole hierarchy of Europe in terms of people is a class hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And I think what America has that is admired by people in other parts of the world is the class fluidity. You can be, you know, I always give Jay-Z as an example. Jay-Z was born in the Marcy Projects of Brooklyn. He's now a partner. I don't know if he still is, but he was a partner in the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. He's a billionaire. Barclays Center is a few miles from the Marcy Projects where he was born and grew up. So that kind of social economic fluidity is a very American phenomenon. You do not have to be consigned to the class that you were born in. If you're smart and enterprising and energetic and hustle, you can move. You can move. That's not true in many in many European society.
And that's what draws a lot of Europeans, well, a lot of the French to the United States.
Absolutely. Very
Um,
appealing.
There's another question also. Well, when we met, we were at the Sister Circle, you know, a community of African American women in Paris. And well, this is one of the gatherings that we can have here in Paris to share, to thrive, to uplift each other. But you do mention in your book that there was still a lack of sense of African American community here in Paris. There was some, do you think there's something that could extra that could be done to develop that sense of community?
You know, I think the African American community in Paris is very strong. What I think Black Americans miss are some of the cultural moorings that you have in the United States, but it's really the result of racism. Things like Black fraternities and sororities, the Black church, the Black press. All of those institutions grew out of a racist society that did not allow us to be a part of. So, and you don't have that in Paris because it's a different situation, it's a different need. Racism is not expressed as virulently as it is in America. So you don't need, I don't think, the same cultural moorings and the same institutional supports that you get in the Black institutions in America.
Another talking point, anyway, for me would be that when I look at my grandfather's example of wanting to leave the States, that was in 1948, and it was another context. He left because of his political ideas and because of his mixed marriage with a white woman, white Jewish woman, and a mixed race daughter, my mother. Although he was really pretty well off in the United States, he had a comfortable home. But, you know, it was still difficult to buy your own home when you were colored, and even if you had money in the United States at that time. But when he left on Gertrude Stein's invitation, he left never to return. Well, of course, it wasn't that easy to go to and fro, Paris, New York, you know. But anyway, I think he traveled back twice in his whole life. Well, not more than, anyway, a pair of times. But today we have a community of full-time, part-time expats here in Paris of African American origins. What do you think explains the difference between this full-time expatriation and this part-time expatriation, apart from the visa part?
Well, you know, James Baldwin was a perfect example of the part-time expatriate. I think for Black Americans, there's always going to be an ancestral pull to America. The history is very deep. The history, much of it is very violent. It's very complicated. And I don't know that anyone, I mean, there are many people who give up their home. But I think for Black Americans, especially the expats now, it's really a class thing. The people who are going back and forth now can afford to. That's major. That's major. And it's also the difference between other Black immigrants coming to Paris from Africa or the Caribbean. I say in the book, the Black Americans who are coming to Paris are not coming by boat. They're coming by jet. They bought a ticket. They probably have a place to stay. They may have a job, but they have resources. And if you have resources, you can exercise freer agency in how you live. You can live 6 months in Paris and 6 months in New York or wherever you live in the States. But that's a class issue. You have to be able to afford that. And with that comes the freedom to think about your life, how you want it to be. You're not to the nose grind all the time, just trying to etch out a living. So if you have the resources to travel back and forth, you also have the leisure to think about what you want your life to look like. And that's very important. And that's a big difference between the Black Americans, I think, who are coming to Paris and other Blacks. Who I think, you know, the African Blacks, the Caribbean Blacks, many of them are coming to Paris for the same reason that immigrants are coming to the United States, greater economic opportunity. But for at least the Black American expats today, I think we're looking for a kind of psychic opportunity, spiritual freedom. It's much more existential, I would say. Mm-hmm. And that comes with, you know, progress. It comes with progress. So in that sense, we're fortunate. You know, I know I'm fortunate. I say that. I'm not, you know, this poor old Black woman, you know, stowing away on a ship coming to. That's why I can complain about, you know, not having central heat, because I know what comfort is. I come from the land of American comfort on some level. On some level.
So what would part 2 of your memoir be now?
Figuring out what to do if Mr. Trump gets back in. I don't think that's going to happen, but I didn't think it was going to happen the first time. So what do I know? But if that were to happen, then I would have to really seriously think about permanent expatriation, which you know, I hope I don't have to. I hope I don't have to do that. But we'll see.
What do we deal with the questions there, or? Oh yeah, there was another. Well, I'm a, you know, as you know, I work in French hospitals, and more particularly, I train nurses and nurses assistants. And you wrote extensively in your book about the socialized French health system that was a real, you know, lifesaver for you and other expats. Would you like to say a little more about that?
Well, I think, you know, 2 French pharmacists saved my life. This was a few years ago. I was in Paris trying to retire. This was in 2007. And I couldn't get one of my high blood pressure medications. And I don't know, I was hanging out with Jake Lamar and Zach Miller. Oh God, who was the third one? Richard Out. Yeah, was it Richard? Anyway, I was hanging out with these brothers. We were drinking, talking, eating. And at the end of the evening, I had a headache that felt like a stroke about to come on. And my dear friend Jo, whose apartment I'm in now, I was living with her at the time. She took me to the pharmacy the next day. My head was about to come off. And these 2 young, blonde, American cheerleading looking girls with stethoscopes took my pressure. It was 190 over 110. They looked at each other. I showed them the vial of medication I couldn't get. They went in a back room. They fiddled around for about 15 minutes, came out with a little vial of 30 tablets. And they said, take one of these for the next 5 days, come back and we'll take your pressure again. The sales girl rang up the bill. These 30 pills cost €6. In 5 days, my pressure was down 50 points. Now, when I saw the 2 girls look at each other after they took my pressure, I knew they were not going to let me out of the pharmacy until they found something to approximate what I needed. And I knew if I didn't have €6 to pay for the 30 pills, they were going to give them to me. They were not letting me walk out and have a stroke. And I had a male friend who is since deceased who lived in Paris. And I told him the story, and he said, the French will not let you die. They had never seen me before. I had no French insurance. I couldn't speak the language. I had no prescription from a doctor. What I had was high blood pressure, 190 over 110. And it's like, sweetheart. And so when I came back and the pressure was down, and they didn't speak much English, but one of them said to me, I think we saved you. And I said, yes, you did, sweetheart. Merci beaucoup. Yes, you did.
That you know how to say. Merci beaucoup.
Yes. All the time, all the time. But that is so unlike I mean, I've gone to my own pharmacy and I've been told it's not time for your prescription to be filled yet. We're not filling it. I had a girlfriend who's older. She had a new prescription. It was $45. She didn't have a lot of money. She said, I stood in the pharmacy and I screamed. I screamed that I can't afford this. And I said, what happened? She said, he cut the cost in half. I guess to get her out of the pharmacy and keep her from screaming. But it's just a way of thinking. It's a way of how you view and value human life. It's not about profit. It's not about the pharmaceutical companies making a killing. It's about keeping people alive. And it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a human being, you're going to be, the doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists are going to work to keep you alive.
But as you say,
I know those girls saved me. I just know that.
But that has a cost because, as you say, it's socialized. It's a socialized health system, and this comes with very high taxes. So, so there is a cost somewhere that
Americans pay high taxes too. It's not like Americans don't pay high taxes, and we pay high healthcare costs.
Yeah.
So we get both.
But the question we keep asking, and this is one of the issues of the re-election or not of our actual president here in France, is the cost of old age and dependency. And that's something we haven't a solution for, how we finance, healthcare for the aging French is a real issue here in France. I don't know what it's like in the States.
Well, it's all about money in the States. I'm of Medicare age now. The best thing about getting older in America, to me, is Medicare. Before I was Medicare age, I was in my own business, so I pay for my own health insurance. My Medicare premium is half of what I was paying on my own before I took Medicare. But I have a good plan. Not all plans are created equal. And the better your plan, the more you're paying for it. So it's still about money. And if you don't have money, you die sooner. You just do. I had an aunt who lived with us, and she had high blood pressure, and she, had a doctor who told her this was a medication she needed, and if she didn't take it, she would die, and she couldn't afford it. And she said, well, what's going to happen if I don't take it? He said, you're going to die. So that's a very different attitude. But it's the American attitude when it comes to healthcare. You will be turned. My friend who said the French won't let you die, he had a pacemaker in his heart.
Yeah.
French doctors put in. And every time it failed, they corrected it. They never, and he was indigent. He was not working, brilliant man, kind of crazy. Never turned away by a hospital, never turned away.
And there's another chapter in your book when you go to visit Chenonceau in the Loire Valley. And there's a part there when you talk about these French white boys looking at you.
These little boys, yeah.
Boys looking at you. And this, can you tell us a little bit more about this? Because I found that part very interesting on how we can perceive the look of others according to our own history.
This was a birthday gift. And my friend, Dr. Bob Tomlinson, is in the audience. He's the one who took me to the castle. And he's showing me, you know, the chateaus in the Loire Valley, because I'm into real estate and I love looking at property. And he's busy showing. And there were kids all around. It was spring break. And every once in a while, there'd be a group of boys and they would stare at me. They would just stare at me. And I'm like, why are they looking? And in the States, and I talk about the gangs in the 80s and the 90s, where young Black men could be killed for staring at another Black man. It's considered an invasion of your space. So I'm in this castle and these kids are like 8 to 12 years old. And every once in a while they were just looking, and I'm like, why are they looking at me? And I didn't say anything to Bob because Bob is very male aggressive gangster, even though he looks genteel, and he is. And I said, if I tell him that these boys are staring at me, he'll curse them out. And it's not necessary to do all that. But what I did, which is what happens when you are stared at, it is a violation. It's why, you know, when you're a kid and you play stare down, you know, whoever blinks first loses, because you've lost the position of self-power. And I could not, one kid, I just said, okay, you know what? I'm gonna stare back and I'm gonna make him stop. And he didn't stop. And I had to like look away. But what I realized about staring, what's uncomfortable about it is that you don't know what the person sees when they're looking at you. And it usually means or you think they have some kind of advantage over you. You don't know what it is. But because they were white and because they were male and because we were in this European castle, I just tripped to their great-great-granddaddies were the hoarders and the enslavers and the colonialists. And they're looking at this old lady who could be their grandmother. In fact, I have 4 granddaughters, who were the ages of these kids. And it's like, here I am in Europe, and European white males are still into that gaze. Now, I had to really step back and say, you know what? A lot of this might be your trip, because kids, by and large, and while they're innocent, are just looking out of curiosity. And I have a cousin in the Bronx, you know, the top drug dealer in the Bronx. And, you know, he said, they just never seen a Black woman, haven't seen a real Black person, and you a nice chocolate sister, and they just looking. This is a guy who would have killed someone staring at him the way these kids were staring at me. So it was just me doing my American racial cultural trip. But I don't know. I don't know why those kids were staring at me. But I do think there was something about male entitlement, gangster aggressive style, things men do. And they do it almost from the time they're born, because they're socialized to do it. Now, again, I could have been projecting all of that onto them.
That was interesting, that part. How we
it made me so uncomfortable that I had to deal with it.
I just want to say I've never beat up a little kid in my life.
I know, Bob. That's why I didn't tell you what they were doing.
Oh, excuse me, one.
Let's have a big round of applause, please, for Ellen and Audrey.
Oh, thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Audrey.
So now we are turning to the question and answer part of the evening. So are there any questions? Yes.
Hi, Audrey. Thank you so much for the talk. I am also an African-American in Paris looking to immigrate into the city. So I just had a question for you related to an earlier part of the conversation about cultural differences and just kind of social mobility. Do you, from your conversations with other expats, African-American expats in Paris, do you feel that social mobility is truly possible or attainable for African Americans in Paris, or is it truly just something that is doable for someone that is kind of a part-time expat? Does that make sense?
My experience, I have not run into Black expats in Paris who are looking to advance in French society in terms of work, in terms of politics. Most of the people that I have met are either retired or have a venture going that's not really dependent upon the greater forces of the French. So I can't really speak to that because I haven't encountered those people. I don't know if that helps, but that just hasn't been my experience.
I can complete maybe Audrey's observation. From what I've understood of our community here, we have some full-timers, and I have one just in front of me who's a nurse, who's my friend, and who left New York never really to return except for short holidays. And it is a big project, and it takes a lot of guts to really penetrate the French culture, to live a full-time, life here. Not only because of Social Security and all the, administration. I mean, if we can't compete with American administration, I mean, I think, but I think there is something to do with the language. There is something to do with job access. Like, for instance, if you're a nurse in the United States and you want to work here in Paris, this is my field, you cannot. You have to take an extra year minimum of training before you can work. This is what my friend here, Shirley, did. So that's, and then some other expats I know have their own businesses here, and one of them has a full-time tourist business here in Paris, but that takes your own personal investment to create your own business, and it isn't easy. So yes, there's something a little freer when you're a part-time expat, I think, than when you decide that you're going to do this full-time. Some others are writers and artists, and we know how hard it is for them to keep going. They write and they create, but they have to have small jobs to keep, to pay bills. So yeah, it isn't an easy thing.
But that's true in America too.
Huh?
That's true in America too. That's true. Yeah. Actually, I think the entrepreneurial spirit is the winning spirit in many cultures. And that's the spirit of, I'm going to invent what I do, whether it's writing, whether it's playing music, whether it's running a business. People, I think you have the opportunity to do that in Paris, just as you have the opportunity to do that in America. And I think people who have that spirit do better wherever they are. They're really kind of inventing themselves, and they're not depending on the parameters of the culture or the workplace of where they're living to define what they're doing. They may take jobs here and there, but they basically are creating their own work life. And the people that I know who do that do it very well.
Great. Let's. We have a question on Zoom that Elliot has selected, is going to read.
Hi. So Monica asks, in what ways is expatriation a solution beyond individual salvation? Does leaving do service to an ailing country during one's time away or later on? She says it's not a criticism.
I didn't get the last part. Does leaving, what's the last part of the question?
She says, does leaving do service to an ailing country during one's time away?
Oh, does it do service to the country you're leaving?
Yes.
Question. It probably doesn't, but I don't care about that. I mean, that's not that's not what I'm thinking about when I'm leaving. Because the country hasn't done service to me. That's my attitude. So, and I know people, I don't argue, I know the people, this is our history, our ancestors died, our blood is in the soil. See, my attitude is I don't have great love for a country where my ancestors' blood is in the soil. I don't get sentimental about that. I get angry about that. So it's just different perspectives. So yeah, it's not about leaving, not being of service to America when I leave. America's not been of service to me. And I think for Black Americans, that is still a great conundrum. We love this country and we want the country to love us. And it's the old, in love with the abusive mate. He ain't gonna love you, sweetie. You might straighten up every once in a while because you make him feel guilty. But, he basically is going to treat you like S. And we find that so hard to deal with. We find it so hard to accept. So we always have this back and forth, I love you. I want you to love me. Why don't you love me? I don't care. You don't love me. And I've never been one of those women in relationships. If you don't love me, I'm not going to try to make you. That's not happening. And we just aren't able as a people. And I understand. But we just aren't able to come out and say that, despite all the evidence that shows it, including what's going on now.
I'd like to complete what Audrey is saying, because that was a big issue for my grandfather. He left and he was very much criticized for continuing to write about America and African Americans while he was, apparently comfortably established here in Paris. And so I'd like to say that, yes, you can do service to an ailing country when you're in exile. And I think you can write and you can be a militant and you can do something maybe with a freer creativity than if you're under the pressure of, a government like the Trump government or, or violence, police violence. Freedom to express yourself. And this is what we find here in Paris. And this is why I'm French and I never chose to go to the States. It's that, we may not have the good heating or, air conditioning, but we can say what we think. Mm-hmm. There's freedom of speech, freedom of press writing, and that is important. So yes, maybe exile, if you know how to express yourself, can enable you to talk about what's going on in your ailing country.
Great. Are there any more questions in the room? Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thanks a lot for this talk. It's very interesting. My thing is, I'm here because I'm like you, I want to get the hell out of America. But I also have family back there, and I've been looking at what's going on there right now with the January 6th, trials. One of the things that bothered me, and I wondered if this had any impact on you, a lot of times they punish Black people for being successful, like they did in 1919 when we came back as heroes from World War I, and then did in World War II as well. And now we had Obama as president. And I'm wondering if we saw Trump as a backlash to having an African-American president. And then just as a part of that, one of the things that always concerned me is we always had a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate while he was in office, and yet we couldn't seem to get anything passed. So it made me wonder how much racism was actually within the Democratic Party. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things I say in the book, and there's a chapter that talks about Obama, what Obama did that really showed the fault lines in America racially was destabilize the whole notion of white superiority. If you are a Black man married to a Black woman running the most powerful country in the world, what does that say to you, white supremacist, who has always been comfortable with this core identity of being superior because you're white? And Obama, and it was not deliberate, it wasn't conscious, but in the 8 years that he was in office, he destabilized the whole premise on which white supremacy was built. Not just him, you know, you had these disaffected white men, by and large, the guys who were in Charlottesville, the guys who were storming the Capitol, the guys who had lost position, lost power, lost a feeling of well-being because the world had changed. Jobs were being sent overseas to colored countries. Immigrants, colored people were coming in, taking jobs. So your core identity of being superior because you were white was under assault. And it was very serious assault. And I raised the question, if I'm white and not superior, then what am I? What am I? And Charlottesville was all about losers trying to feel like winners again. The Confederacy was a lost proposition. The South lost the war 150 years ago. We still have folk who have not accepted that, because to accept that is to assault who they are fundamentally. And that creates dissidence, it creates hatred, resentment, it creates a form of madness. So when you have these guys storming the Capitol and running around with a moose head on, whatever that was, these are folk who are totally out of sorts because their identity has been challenged at its fundamental core, which is, I'm white, but I'm not feeling superior. And I'm acting out because this is, it's you know, an assault to your being. It's an assault to your being. But you know, it didn't get cast like that. And I think any Black success, whether it's Tulsa, whether it's Obama, the resentment on the part of whites is that this is destabilizing how I see me. And if I don't see me as superior, then I'm going to destroy that which is making me feel less superior. And it's just a kind of psychic resentment. I think, a form of insanity. I think so much of American racism is a form of insanity because it gets to people's core beliefs and it gets to how they see themselves at the core. So when that's disrupted, when that's shown to be untrue, which is what the whole critical race theory is about. You know, these are folk who can't take responsibility for their history. I don't want to own it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want you talking about it. I don't want you teaching it. That is such an infantile, 2-year-old tantrum. No, 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 no. I mean, come on. France at least can nation up. America has never been able to nation up and own its sins. And if you can't do that, you're doomed. You're doomed. And it's never been able to do that. And it's worse. Now it's worse.